All right, welcome back, Matt Hudson. We are glad to have you back for another conversation, this time about campaigns and elections. For students who are tuning in, possibly for the first time or out of order, I'd like you to meet Representative Matt Hudson, the lawmaker who sponsored the legislation that led to this class being a requirement for undergraduate students across the state, in addition to middle school students and high school students. He served in a lot of other roles, which I'll give him the chance to share some about at the outset of this. So welcome back.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm glad to be here. It is always great to be able to interact with students. It's a little different on Zoom. Been on campus many times in various capacities, but I certainly appreciate the opportunity today to speak to your students about something that is near and dear to my heart, and that's civics and how government works. As you mentioned, I was a former state representative, and I also was Speaker Pro Tem of the Florida House of Representatives. I also wrote the healthcare budget for 6 years for the House of Representatives, and in a prior life, I also served as fire commissioner in my community. So a bit of a diverse background of public service. So.
That's great. And we're going to get to actually talk about how some of those, how that local process differed from maybe running for a state office in this module. But first, I want to get right out of the bat a conversation that our students themselves are going to be able to debate in their town hall discussion relating to the Electoral College. So just as to set the ground for their conversation, they're going to be debating, should it be eliminated? Should we instead have a presidency that's determined by a national popular vote? In your mind, so how does that work, and what do you think the values of it are?
Well, I think the important thing to remember is that we have 50 states, and that all 50 states matter. So if you were to have a popular vote for president, then really only 4 states would matter: California, Texas, New York, and Florida. Those 4 states. Well, actually, in rank of population, it would be California, Texas, Florida, then New York. But the reality is, those 4 states would determine the outcome of every presidency for the future. And so I don't think that that is necessarily fair if you happen to be living, 30 miles north in Thomasville, Georgia, or if you happen to be producing wheat in Kansas. I don't think it's fair that 4 states should dictate the life that you live. I think that the founding fathers believed, much like they set up the House of Representatives and the Senate, that there should be equity between the two, and that the House, the People's House, if you will, is dictated by 435 members that are portioned based upon the population of each individual state. But at the same token, because we are a government of checks and balances, the Senate, every state gets 2 senators to create a checks and balances so that every state has a voice. At the end of the day, we all pay taxes. We all care about what's going on in this country, and we care about our communities. And so everybody have a voice in that. I just think that's the appropriate way to go. And it would be completely irresponsible to disenfranchise 45 states in the union, at least. I think that's just patently wrong.
So that kind of gets to the bigger question of, we live in a democratic republic, which is different than a straight democracy or what misunderstandings do you think there are when it comes to those words? How do you think that matters for elections overall?
Well, I think when you think about who you're going to who you want to vote for, you have to remember what you're voting for them to do, right? And so in our form of government, you are asking for someone to be your voice in your government, right? And so set aside political parties for a second. You want to be able to connect with that person that has the same beliefs, ideals, morals, values that you do, because you believe that that person could adequately represent you as your voice in your particular government. And in a republic, that's what we're striving to do, right? We want to make sure that you have the right voice representing you. And if you don't, you vote them out, right? I mean, you have a bunch of students here in your class today that probably got Bright Future scholarships, because I'm sure it's a very smart lot. Otherwise, they wouldn't have you as a professor. So at the end of the day, it might be helpful for you to think about as an elector: am I going to vote for somebody that believes in bright futures? Right? That might be an important topic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is that particularly Republican or Democrat? Absolutely not. But it is something that is important to you, right? It needs to be something that's important to you. And so in our form of government, connecting with the person that you're going to send to be your voice, I think that's the most important thing to me. So that's what I believe is the core to how our government is supposed to work. You know, back in the founding fathers' day, when we had 13 colonies, they would send a handful of people from each state to represent them. Now, back then it was a little bit different because they were all male and they were all landowners because that's how the world worked. But we evolved, we changed, and got better. But as a rule, now we vote for people that we believe best represent us. And if you look at Congress, there are some people that are wildly outspoken one way or the other. But you know what? Their districts voted for them. Their districts sent them there. They are
Mm-hmm.
representing their constituencies. And so it's hard to say that we should change that process, right? When you have the opportunity to be elected by the people that are asking you to be their voice, we ought to stick with that.
So from the candidate side, then, this was a question that I had in mind earlier. Can you want to convince voters that you will represent their interests? And so I know you mentioned in our previous conversation that we had recorded earlier that you did a lot of listening in order to be able to feel like you were going to best take the opinions and thoughts of your constituents back with you. As a candidate, though, prior to being elected, obviously campaigns make promises. Partly, maybe the promise is to be responsive, and that's the biggest promise. Maybe the promise is something very specific, like I will vote to change this particular policy, or what happens when you go from candidate to elected? How do the promises you've made or what you've observed from your colleagues, how do campaign promises translate once a person is holding that seat?
Well, I think it probably varies a little bit depending on the campaign. If you're at the national level or at the state level, at the local level, there's different things that come up. But if we're in the middle of a big election season right now in the midterms and all that. And, if you were to watch campaign ads for people running for Congress or for the Senate or whatnot, depending on which party you are, they basically talk about three things, right? Well, if you're on the right-leaning side, well, then it's, I want less taxes, less government, more opportunity for individuals. And if you're on the other side, well, then I'm really concerned about climate change, I'm really concerned about the environment, and I'm really concerned about healthcare for all, let's say. I mean, just three topics, right?
Sure.
But they always just talk about three things. They don't necessarily make promises, they just talk an awful lot, okay? And so I think that is the way they get themselves kind of off the hook a little bit, if you will, at the national level. At the state level, we're going to have a gubernatorial race here, and you'll have, former Governor Christ against current Governor DeSantis, and each one of them will have their talking points. And I don't think you're going to hear an awful lot of promises. You'll hear what would be more referred to as rhetoric, which is be more platitudes about what they philosophically believe in, how that actually settles down to be an individual promise, maybe not. Now, when you go to the state house or the state senate level, now it's more of a localized situation. The governor is going to represent 23 million people, right? But remember, the House of Representatives is going to represent 145,000. Okay, now you have the ability to actually talk to a lot more people that you're actually going to represent, right? And so when you're having those one-on-one conversations and during the campaign, I know in my elections, I typically routinely knocked on between 4,000 and 5,000 doors every campaign. Well, now,
Mm-hmm.
when you're meeting with somebody face to face, well, that's a whole lot different than when you're doing a TV ad across the country, right? Or across the
Right.
state. Now I'm having a conversation with Bob and Mary at their front door, right? And they want to know what I'm about and what makes me who I am and why I should vote for them. And that's it, right? And so now you're selling yourself to people you don't know to say, hey, here's who I am, here's what I'm about, and here's what I hope for this district. And now they're either going to accept that or they're not, right? Um, I'm not. I never went down the path of, well, I'm going to change X or I'm going to change Y or I'm going to build this or I'm going to tear down that. That was never me. I wanted them to have confidence in me as a person because if they have confidence in me as a person, the issues are always going to change, right? There's issues that come and go and all that kind of stuff, and there's new ones that pop up, and there's things that bubble to the surface and become really super exciting on TV, and then there's the mundane stuff that you just got to do. All those things are important. Every vote you take is important, but it's more important that you know the person that's taking the vote, right? Because if you believe in that person, you believe that person has your beliefs, morals, values, and ideals, then chances are, for the most part, they're going to be voting the same way you would, right? And so I think that to me is the most important thing. The campaign promises, that was never my deal,
Mhm.
because so much of that is out of your control. As a member of the House, you're one of 120. Okay. I mean, I'd like to think I'd get my way all the time, but I don't recall getting my way all the time in middle school. So I mean, what the heck, right? So the reality is, you have to think about all the bevy of issues, what relative position you have in that. And making campaign promises to me is just foolhardy, honestly. I would rather have somebody be able to know me and know who I am and feel confident in me. And we'll have our disagreements, and that's fine. And I will tell
That-
you a little tidbit. I took that to the extreme. I actually did an ad once where I gave every one of my constituents my cell phone number. And that way, if they ever had a concern or question, they could just call me or text me.
Did they?
Because, yeah, oh, boy, did they. And I bet you probably now, even though I've been out of office for 6 years, I probably get a text or a phone call every month, just checking to see if, you know, this my still my number, things like that.
Right.
And but it was very helpful because people felt like they had access to a decision maker. They
So it
felt like
sounds
I
like
was
your
truly
promise,
representing them.
right? So your promise to your constituents was that you were going to be acceptable. You had mentioned our last interview that you took every meeting that was requested, which is again remarkable. So your promise was more who you were going to be in office, not so much I was going to vote A every time or I was going to vote against B every time.
Yes,
Uh,
that is
so
that is
that
exactly right. So I guess correct. I did make a campaign promise in that regard that um, I would be transparent and that they could hold me accountable. Right? They could ask me questions when they wanted to ask me questions. They could critique me if they wanted to critique me. They could praise me if they wanted to praise me. But they would know what I was doing. I would post every day on Facebook what I was up to, so that they could say,
mhm.
"Hey, we like what you're doing," or "We don't," and people felt a very good sense of connection that way to their government.
So what factors then during a campaign, and our students are going to be kind of reading about the balance between this. Obviously, there's fundraising, media, there's endorsements, there's interest groups, there's the candidate personality. Uh, if any one of those is missing, or which one of those do you feel maybe exceeds all others in influence? Are there any, or is it really the combination that makes a difference?
Well, that's a good question, which I suppose coming from a professor makes sense. I think it really is a blend, and it depends on the race too, right? So if you are having a primary
Mhm.
and you're running against somebody in your own party, okay, well now that's a different strategy than if you're running in a general election against somebody from the opposite party. Because if you're running from somebody in the opposite party, then oftentimes people will naturally see the distinctions just right off the get-go in their own mind. Okay, this person's a
Mhm.
Republican, this person's a Democrat, right? And so now you're working hard to try and influence the people that are independents, right? The NPAs out there
Yes.
in the world, right? But if it's a primary, now, if there's two Democrats running, well, then people have a general sense in their mind of what the basic philosophy should be between the two. How do you sway that? So does that become now a greater influence on your personality? Does that become a greater influence on the fact that I have to convince people not to vote for the other person in the same party? And so I'm going to need more money to do that. So I'm going to have to fundraise more to do more TV, more radio, more mail, whatever. So I think a lot of it depends on the race itself.
Mhm.
Now, the first race I ran, I got out fundraised 3.5 to 1.
You're for the first state house race.
Yes, I
Yeah.
got fundraised 3.5 to 1. I mean, I just got smoked. It was terrible. And so as a result, I just decided I'd have to work harder. And so I went to more doors. And so in about a 7 week period of time, I hit 5,000 doors and took my message directly to people because I couldn't afford to do radio. I couldn't afford to send mail. I couldn't afford to do TV. And so I had no choice but to work harder and to take my message of who I was directly to people.
And
So,
it sounds like that worked. I mean, you were a major underdog in that primary.
Yes, I was certainly not the candidate that anybody expected would win, and except for maybe me. But at the end of the day, you gotta believe in yourself, because if you don't believe in yourself, nobody else is going to. So I just went and thought, you know what, if if I'm running against four people of my same party, or three people also of my same party, I've got to figure out how to do things differently. And one candidate was super well funded, had lots of TV, lots of radio, lots of mail clogging people's mailboxes. Another candidate had tremendous volunteer network. I mean, just a crazy amount of volunteers. And then one of the other candidates was even in my same profession, so I couldn't say, well, I was different because I had this kind of job, right? And so at the end of the day, I knew that the only thing that was going to overcome that was just hard work, and that's what I did.
Do you see a different when somebody's elected uh, in when somebody has had a really hard fought race to get to that seat? Does that look different in practice than the lawmaker who like ran away with it or maybe was unopposed for the past many election cycles? Do you see uh, did you continue to have these challenging races over the period of time that you were in office, or
Well, I ran a lot of races because I my first race for the House was a special election. Um, the person that held the seat before me passed away unexpectedly from a debilitating illness, and so the governor called for a special election. And I came in a little late and was out fundraised, all that kind of stuff. And so that first election, that first primary, was wildly satisfying to win, just because I had worked so hard. My son and I both, we just worked our fannies off to try and get me across the finish line, and winning that was huge. And then I had the general election, 6 weeks later, and won that one. My first race, I will say, I won by 150 votes. And so when you are wondering, should I go vote today? Will my vote matter? Well, I'm a guy that won by 150 votes, not exactly what one would call a landslide. Okay. And so I can tell you every vote matters, and it matters a lot. And so um, subsequent races, I had one where I wasn't opposed at all, didn't have a primary, and then wasn't opposed. I had a couple of general election opponents here and there. Um, the first one meant the most, I think, because of the fact that it was the first, not because of other factors. There's something that is, to me, wildly humbling. The day you wake up after an election, and by the way, class, there used to be these things called newspapers. They actually printed them. I know they don't anymore, hardly. But when you wake up the day after an election and you see your name as the winner in that race, and see that thousands of people have have entrusted you with their single most precious commodity, their trust, man, it doesn't get old. It doesn't matter if it's your first election or your last election, whether you win the election or don't lose the election. My last election, I lost. Okay. But you know what? There were still thousands of people that believed that I was the right guy. Now, were there a few thousand more that believed in the other person, but that's okay. That's our process. But it is still humbling to think that you were able to convince that many people that you should be their voice in their government. And that to me that's a powerful thing. And it just doesn't get old. I think the day that any member of the legislature or member of Congress walks into a respective chamber and doesn't have a wow moment, that's the day they should leave. Because it is wildly humbling to walk into the Florida House of Representatives chamber, see your name up in lights, see your name on your desk, and if there's a moment that just doesn't go, holy heck, how did I get here? And man, I get to vote today to impact 23 million people. Man, that's just crazy. And if you're not in awe of that, then you shouldn't be doing the job. I just fundamentally believe that.
I hear that. So, I mean, I think that sense of awe and humility um, is is probably not what people think of, at least in popular culture when talking about politicians.
You're
And so I'm
absolutely
I'm glad that these students are getting to hear that. For to see there may be some folks who've never talked to an elected state lawmaker before, but there's a lot of heart in it, in addition to all the other stuff. But now to talk about some of the other stuff. Uh,
okay.
So thinking about, we talked last interview sort of about money in the lawmaking process, but now I want to hear a little bit about the role of money in campaigns. What does that look like? How do people raise it? What is the role of lobbyists? Are there strings connected to that in reality? What do those pressures look like in practice?
Well, there's an awful lot of people that would say we should have less money in politics, and I think that ideally, yes, that would be fine. However, there's a couple of fundamental truths. If you represent 145,000 people, like a state legislator does, or if you're a state senator that's representing, in excess of 500,000 people, you can't possibly meet all of those people, not in a campaign. It's just not physically possible to do that. Even if you're very well intended, you just can't, the time frame just doesn't work. So that means you're going to need some form of media to reach people, whether that's going to be mail, whether that's going to be radio, whether that's going to be TV, whether that's going to be social media. All of that costs money. Okay, there's just a practical side to
Right.
that. So you're never going to get rid of money in politics as long as those things continue to cost money, which I would presume they're going to continue to cost money because, they need to make their money too. And so given that reality, you have to set forth and say, okay, what am I going to need to be able to accomplish what I need to do? And so you're going to set a budget for your campaign. I had my first campaign, I think I had a budget of maybe $25,000, which was, considerably less than all of my opponents. And then my last race was right at about 1.7 million. And so, how do you raise that money, right? Well, like anything, you got to ask, right? I mean, to your students in the class, when you were in high school and didn't have a job and weren't driving yet, and you wanted to go to the movies, well, you had to get somebody to drive you and had to get somebody to pay for it, right? So ask mom and dad or a brother or whatever, and hey, there you go. Well, if you're a candidate, you know what? You got to ask people, hey, I'm running for the state house, and Dr. Cyphers, I really need some support. I was wondering if you might consider donating to my campaign. So there's all those personal appeals that you make just one-on-one. Then of course there's going to be fundraising that you do over social media. Maybe you have your own website and you're going to get some small donations through those. You might hold a big fundraiser, have everybody in the community come out and meet you and have some hosts that put it on for you and all those kinds of things. Tremendous amount of coordination to be able to do that. And if you're raising $25,000, not so bad. If you have to raise 1.7, now that's a lot of fundraisers. That's an awful lot of fundraisers. And so the practical side is that you're then also, you've got your normal sources, like I said, your online things and your local fundraisers and your personal appeals, but that's only going to get you so far. Because in Florida, you also have campaign finance limits that no one is able to receive more than $1,000 from any person, entity, or corporation. And so that if I need to raise $25,000, well, then the easy way would be to find $25,000 donors, right? Of course, that's
Right.
like next to impossible. So you got to think, well, how many $20 donors do I need to get to that 25,000,
I
right?
see.
Now all of a sudden you go, ooh, that's a lot, right?
Right.
And so then other things come into play. So in the political process, organizations will hire lobbyists, and I will tell you that lobbyist is not a bad word. If you are, let's say you're in where I used to represent was Southwest Florida, the Naples, Fort Myers, area, and so, maybe you're an organization in Southwest Florida, and you've got an issue that you're concerned about in Tallahassee. Well, you don't want to drive to Tallahassee perpetually, right? It's 450 miles for Pete's sake, right? So you're going to hire a lobbyist that's already in Tallahassee to kind of speak on your behalf. Okay, is there anything wrong with that? Of course not. You want to have your voice heard? Okay, there's somebody that you can hire to be your voice, right? And so those same lobbyists representing those organizations, and it could be an association, it could be a company, it could be an individual. Lobbyists represent all kinds of different things. You're going to, as a candidate, you're also going to kind of reach out to those lobbyists and say, hey, I'm running for re-election, or I'm running for election, whichever it might be. Really would appreciate your support. And some of them are going to Some of them are going to donate to your campaign. You might also have a political committee, what some might call a PAC. And those political committees can receive unlimited amounts of money. There's no campaign restriction there. However, they are transparent. Every political committee has to list all of its donors and all of their expenses for the public to see. So you as a citizen can know who I took money from. And so, if I took money, let's say from, oh, I don't know, pick a company, let's Florida Power and Light. I don't know. I just naming a company off the top of my head. If I got $2,000 from Florida Power and Light, you as a citizen ought to be able to know that. And then if I'm voting on something that might pertain to Florida Power and Light, you need to be able to determine, hey, do you suppose he voted that way because of that, or because that was just a good idea and need to be voted on, right? And so that's a determination that you need to know. But that's where my transparency came through, because I would tell people what I was voting on a very regular basis, and then they could hold me accountable, right?
Right.
In terms of strings attached, I was probably a little different than that. Some people won't take money from certain organizations. And I believe when you make a decision that you won't accept money from group A or group B, that's when I believe you've already been influenced. Because I believe that everybody should have an open playing field. Now, I will tell you that I don't smoke. I'm an anti-smoking kind of person. My dad had cancer, so I don't smoke because of that. And I will tell you that a number of cigarette manufacturers wanted to donate to my campaign. Okay, if you want to, but I would tell them right up front, look, I don't believe in your product, and I will actively be voting against you. You understand that, right? You do? Okay, well then feel free to contribute if you want, right? I mean, I felt I was very transparent with people to let them know, but I also felt that when you say you're not going to take from that cigarette group, well, now you've already indicated a bias against them, right?
Interesting.
If you decide not to take money from, I don't know, an oil company, right? Now all of a sudden you've already declared your bias against it. It tells them that you've already made up your mind before you even heard what they've had to say. And to me, that's
Have
not right.
have votes in. The example you just gave was saying, okay, well, I'm willing to take the money from you, cigarette company, but just know ahead of time, this does not mean I'm going to vote with you, because I'm pretty sure I'm going to vote against you. In the reverse, have you experienced a case where next go around, next election cycle, one of those companies says, I don't like how you voted, so I'm going to give a bunch of money to your opponent, or something to that effect?
No, actually, I never had a scenario where, if I had received previous support from them, that I didn't get their support in the future.
Gotcha.
There were times where in campaigns, organizations that had never supported me before might work against me.
Right.
I believe there was, which year was it? Maybe the '08 campaign, where a particular union in the state of Florida spent about 50 grand to try and keep me from getting elected. But you know what? I still met with them every year.
Right.
So, it wasn't like I held a grudge or any of that kind of stuff. I wasn't real wild about it, obviously, but at the same token, you know what? They scheduled a meeting. Let's talk, right? So,
Right. So you didn't necessarily feel punished in that respect for votes that you had taken.
no, no, not at all. Because, at the end of the day, people have their belief structures, right? And if they
Right.
don't think that I'm the right person to represent them, well, then they need to do what they need to do to try and get the person they believe is the right person, right? And so it's about making that personal connection to me.
Mhm. What would you recommend to students as this is it, like this lecture is going to be listened to by students right in the wheelhouse of Florida's midterms right now. So what would you recommend to students who are consumers of campaign ads, like negative ads, mailers? What do you look for in some of that to try to weed out what might be a credible attack on a candidate from something that might not be fair? Is there any way to know unless you're really deep in?
A couple of things. There's a famous quote by Ronald Reagan: "Trust but verify." Okay, and so if if you sat down at at the bar at Potbelly's and sat next to somebody, would you believe every single thing that person told you after about an hour and a half of drinking? Probably not, right? And I'm not suggesting your entire class has been to Potbellies. However, I'm sure everybody knows where it is, right? And so the reality is, if you wouldn't believe somebody that you're sitting next to, that you're buddies with, 100% of the time, why would you believe a random piece of mail that got sent to your house about somebody, right? And so take the time to dig in and look at your ballot, right? So, the best suggestion I always tell people is print your sample ballot in advance, okay? You can go to the supervisor of elections, and many of you are voting in your communities back where you live in Florida or other state. You can print your sample ballot in advance, and you can look at all the people that you're going to be asked to vote upon. And then from there, I usually keep the ballot in a folder, and all those pieces of mail that come in, I toss them into a folder with the sample ballot. And then I sit down, some random weekday evening and sit there with the laptop and kind of crunch through and go, well, okay, I gotta vote for somebody for governor. I've been given these 6 pieces of mail. Boy, that one seems crazy. That one seems crazy. I wonder if that's true. Ooh, what about that? Interesting. And then I start doing my own research, right? And then it's important. Everybody always talks about the real exciting positions. Oh, the governor's race or the president. Well, when you really stop and think about it, the president doesn't impact our daily lives a whole heck of a lot. The governor doesn't impact our lives a whole heck of a lot. However, your county commissioner or your city commissioner or your school board member or your state representative impact your lives tremendously. The lion's share of what government does that impacts your life on a daily basis is done at the local and the state level, not the federal level. And so really dig into those races and ask some questions, right? I mean, this is the question of who you want to represent you, right? And take the party labels off of it, okay? And so go to that person, that campaign's website, learn a little bit about their background, right? They may in their flyer be talking about 2 or 3 things, but probably on their website, they will state a position on where they are on a dozen things. Now you have a little bit better insight into that person. Or you read their bio and go, oh, wow, this person is married, got a couple of kids. Oh, they went to the same school as I did, whatever. And now all of a sudden you start to feel a little personal connection, right? And so it's about doing your research and really digging into what makes those candidates tick.
So, what would you say? We hear a lot about, there's the big party caucuses, there's Republicans, there's Democrats. What would you share with our students about what other types of like caucuses that exist within the legislature that aren't just about parties? So regions or issue areas, like how do lawmakers relate to one another beyond just the party duality?
Well, and again, I think it's obviously different between DC and Tallahassee. Your local politics typically don't have a lot of that party stuff going on because on a city commission there's 5 or 6 seats or 7 seats. I mean, it's just not that big, right?
Right.
But in Tallahassee, in a chamber of 120 members or 40 in the Senate, or DC 435 and 100, you've got a lot more going on. A lot of times within a respective chamber, they will create a caucus for various subject matter areas. We had a bio caucus in Florida for a period of time for those people that were really interested in science and development and things like that, which I was involved in. There are caucuses on any number of different subject matters, and those kind of things become ways that all of a sudden you look over and you go, wow, I didn't know that guy had an interest in that. Well, that's kind of interesting, right? Now all of a sudden you found a connectivity point, right? It's kind of like if you are you live in South Florida, and then you might have somebody that lives in Pensacola, right? And you both show up to the same event. You never knew each other, but once you're there, you know that you have that sense of commonality of what that event is, right? And that creates an opportunity to have a conversation. And from that conversation is that mutual respect and civility, right? And so those caucuses allow for that opportunity to share. And sometimes, honestly, sometimes they're faith-based. We had a legislative fellowship caucus in the legislature where we got together once a week as a group, and we just talked as regular people. There was no politics allowed. We'd have a little bit of a faith lesson and in some denomination, it didn't matter what, and we would talk about what was going on in each other's lives. And man, It was wonderful because suddenly, that guy that you didn't talk to all the time or wasn't on a committee you normally served with, but you could see that, hey, something had been bugging him. Well, you come to find out that their kid has been sick or they've been having challenges at work or whatever. And it's that common bond that's created. And I think that is something that most people would not realize. Everybody thinks that because politics is, so polarized and all those kinds of things that people don't talk together. They absolutely do. In Tallahassee, there's a members dining hall where, you can go in the morning and have a cup of coffee and sit down, maybe have a bagel or something. And, there'll be a half a dozen other legislators there and sit down and, amazing things happen when you break bread together. And it doesn't matter if it's at home with your family or with total strangers or with people that you work with. Sitting down having a meal, you know what? You instantly become at ease and you're just talking about stuff, right? It's not high level stuff, it's just stuff, right? And that stuff is the bonds that create friendships and that's a beautiful thing in that regard. And I think those kind of opportunities are the things that happen all the time in Tallahassee, but nobody knows about, right? And so they think that Tallahassee is just as weird as what they see on TV for DC, and it's not. And don't misunderstand me. We got some weirdos in Tallahassee too, in both parties, but there's an awful lot more of folks that just come together and are friends. Some of my best friends along the way in this process were people in the opposite party of mine, and it wasn't a matter of party. It was just, hey, we became friends, and that's how it should be.
I definitely remember as staff, the House Senate softball games that were about once a year way back then. I'm not sure they still happen now. That was that kind of experience for me early on as well, where uh, those relationships were formed. What would you recommend closing out with the students now if somebody wanted to get involved, got caught the bug, wanted to get involved in campaigns, didn't know somebody personally yet? How does a young person or a student approach a campaign or a candidate um, to jump in?
Well, a couple things I will tell you. There isn't a candidate in the planet that doesn't want volunteers. Okay, if they say they don't want volunteers, right off the bat, go ahead and not vote for them because something's wrong with them. Okay, I'm kidding. But the reality is, every campaign is always looking for people to assist. And from that activity on the campaign, oftentimes there becomes great internship opportunities, sometimes job opportunities after that. A guy that volunteered on my first campaign became my first legislative aide. And so there's just opportunities along the way that present themselves. If you want to get engaged, you can either reach out directly to that campaign. Typically through their website is the easiest way to do it, or sometimes they'll have a campaign office, so they'll have a phone number on their website or whatever, and just say, hey, I'd love to get involved in a small way or a big way. I've got a little bit of time, or hey, I can give you Wednesday evenings, whatever it is. It can be a very little amount or it can be a huge amount. It just depends. But I can tell you that every campaign would be thrilled to have people on. My last couple of campaigns, I typically ran on average about 12 campaign volunteers at a time and had one paid staff person. And so we had a pretty good sized group, but those campaign volunteers knew other people. And so sometimes our ranks would swell up to 24, 36 people.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they'd drop down a little bit, but we were always welcoming people in. And when you get on the inside of it, then you really start to get a good picture of what that candidate's like in person. Is what you hear them saying actually what it really is? Are they the person that you think they are? You've done your research. Oh, I want to go work for candidate X. Well, that's great. Then you get there and you go, you know, I'm not so sure I really like candidate X. You know what? Maybe this was insightful to me, right? But all of those things become learning opportunities, right? It's kind of like going on a job interview. Even if you don't get the job, the interview process itself should have taught you something for the next time. And so working on a campaign will teach you a tremendous amount about that candidate, about the process, and it's as simple as usually shooting a email or quick phone call through the website.
Well, I sure hope that some of the folks in this class kind of take up the chance to do that. And I'm also happy to share resources with those who have questions and about how to do it. I can't thank you enough for just taking so much time out of your day to chat with us about your experiences in the legislature and since and before. So thank you for your service to the state and for joining in.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I will tell y'all, if you end up having questions or anything, please reach out to the professor and she'll reach out to me. I'm happy to share any ideas or suggestions along the way or point you to people that I might know. I think it's incumbent upon whether you're a leader now or a past leader that you should always be developing people. Frankly, our republic depends on it. So thank you. I appreciate your time and attention today, and go Knowles.